Hello, Homo sapiens, and welcome to. Take a moment to settle in, whether you're preparing to sleep, unwinding after a long day, or just letting your mind drift while cooking, showering, or working with headphones on. This channel is here for slow science and quiet storytelling. No hype, no wild speculation, just humble archaeology and careful history told softly. If you value this kind of long-form content, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way to knowledge and maybe conquer the world with curiosity instead of noise. And if you'd like, share in the comments how you use these stories. Do you listen at night before bed or during the day as you work? However you join us, know that if you drift off mid-chapter, I've placed timestamps in the description so you can pick up right where you left off, because the story is worth hearing all the way through. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight, we begin with the oldest migration into the Americas, a journey that rewrote the human map. Tonight, we begin with a question that lingers at the heart of history. Why does the story of the Americas so often begin far too late? In the average American classroom, history begins with the year 1492, when Columbus crossed an ocean and stumbled onto a continent that millions of people already called home. A year that became a shorthand rhyme for schoolchildren, a turning point that textbooks insist is the beginning of American history. Yet for those of us who have spent time with archaeology, genetics, and the traces of deep time, it is striking how shallow that entry point is. Tens of thousands of years had already passed. Whole civilizations had risen and fallen. Landscapes had been settled, abandoned, and settled again. The real beginning was not a European ship appearing on the horizon, but small groups of human beings indistinguishable from us, finding their way into a vast, unpeeled land at the edge of the world. The choice to start with Columbus is not simply a matter of chronology, but of perspective. It centers the story on contact rather than origins, on written records rather than oral memory, on the perspective of one small corner of humanity rather than the global journey that carried all of us to every corner of the planet. It is a story compressed to fit the neat boundaries of nation-states and political events, but one that leaves out the greater adventure. And that adventure is the last chapter in the tale of human migration. Long after our species had walked out of Africa, long after we had settled Europe and Asia, long after we had even reached Australia by sea, the Americas remained the final frontier. Why then is this frontier so often erased? Part of the answer lies in evidence, or rather the lack of it. For much of the 20th century, the remains of early life in the Americas was scarce, hard to interpret, and easy to doubt. Archaeologists struggled to agree on what was truly ancient and what was simply old. Sites that might have changed the story were dismissed as contaminated or misdated. In the absence of clarity, a convenient narrative held sway, the so-called Clovis first model. According to that model, people only arrived in the Americas around 13,500 years ago, just after the last ice sheets retreated, leaving behind their distinctive fluted spear points. It was a neat package, clean and seemingly logical. The problem was that it was wrong. Over time, the cracks began to show. Evidence from Chile, Canada, and the United States suggested people had been here earlier than the Clovis toolkit allowed. Bones with butchery marks, hearths with charcoal far older than expected, footprints fossilized in ancient lake beds. Each piece of evidence suggested that the story began much earlier, yet the textbooks did not budge. The rhyme of Columbus endured. The story of first peoples remained in limbo, trapped behind professional skepticism and public indifference. What is at stake here is not simply a date on a timeline, but our understanding of who the first Americans were and how their arrival reshaped the world. Imagine for a moment the landscapes they encountered. North America, between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago, was home to a caste of animals that now seem almost mythical. Mammoths taller than houses, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, beavers the size of bears. When humans entered these lands, they were not walking into an untouched wilderness, but into an ecological drama that had been unfolding for millions of years. Their presence would tilt the balance, sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically. To leave this out of history is to erase not just people but entire worlds. There is another reason why the story of early America has been pushed aside. It is uncomfortable. It does not conform to tidy national myths. If people were here 15 or 20,000 years ago, then American history does not begin with European colonization or even with the rise of Mesoamerican empires, but with nameless bands of hunter-gatherers whose stories survive only in fragments of bone and stone. They did not leave monuments on the scale of Egypt or Mesopotamia. They did not write their names in stone, but they endured harsh climates, innovated and adapted. To study them is to acknowledge that our species has always been restless, always been moving, always been reinventing itself at the edge of survival. For decades, scientists argued bitterly about the earliest dates. Careers were built and destroyed on the acceptance or rejection of a handful of sites. Some researchers who dared to publish evidence of a pre-Clover presence were ostracized, accused of sloppiness, or quietly ignored. And yet slowly, the tide shifted. Better dating methods, more careful excavations, and advances in genetics gave weight to the idea that people had been here much longer than once assumed. The neat story of Clovis first began to unravel, and in its place grew a messier, richer, more human story. To start history at Columbus is to miss that story. To start history at Clovis is to cut it short by thousands of years. The truth, as best as we can see it now, is that people entered the Americas at multiple times, in multiple ways, long before the textbooks admit. Some groups may have come by sea, hugging the Pacific coast in small boats. Others may have walked through temporary corridors when the glaciers retreated. Some migrations may have failed, leaving no living descendants. Others succeeded and flourished. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event, but a long process filled with false starts and forgotten paths. This matters because it changes how we understand ourselves. If we begin with Columbus, then history is a story of conquest and contact. If we begin with Clovis, then it is a story of hunters chasing mammoths across a melting ice age. But if we begin with the earliest arrivals 20 or even 30,000 years ago, then history becomes a story of human persistence at the edge of possibility. It becomes a story not of sudden discovery, but of gradual settlement, of resilience, of adaptation to some of the harshest conditions on Earth. And this is not just academic hair-splitting. The story we tell about beginnings shapes how we think about everything that follows. If the Americas were only populated late, then their indigenous peoples are framed as recent arrivals, almost temporary tenants. But if their roots go back tens of thousands of years, then they are among the oldest continuous cultures on the planet. That distinction matters, not just in classrooms, but in politics, in identity, in how societies value heritage. What we know so far is still incomplete. Archaeology is a patient science, and every new site discovered may rewrite what we thought we knew. Scientists, when they are honest, will tell you that they do not have all the answers. What we have are fragments, signals from the deep past, stitched into a story that is always provisional. But even with those fragments, the outline is clear. The real history of the Americas does not begin in the 15th century, nor in the 13th millennium before present. It begins much earlier with people whose names we will never know, but whose footprints, bones, and tools remind us that they were here living, struggling, imagining. So the haunting question lingers: how much earlier did it begin? And how many chapters have already been lost to time? If textbooks one day start the story in the deep past, will we finally see the Americas not as a land discovered late, but as a land always waiting and eventually found by people who are already like us, in every way that matters? What global journey did humans already complete before turning toward the Americas? To understand why the story of the first Americans matters, we need to step back and recognize the path that had already been traveled by our kind long before anyone set foot in the New World. The Americas were not the first frontier. They were the last. For tens of thousands of years before that final crossing, humans had been moving outward from their birthplace in Africa, spreading across continents, adapting to landscapes as different as tundra and desert, and carrying with them not only tools, but languages, ideas, and social worlds. By the time small groups eventually found themselves near the edge of Siberia, staring across toward a continent they could not yet see, their species had already achieved something astonishing. They had gone from a local primate to a global presence. The journey begins in Africa. fossil and genetic evidence suggests that our species, Homo sapiens, emerged there roughly 300,000 years ago. For a long stretch of prehistory, our ancestors remained primarily within Africa, experimenting with stone tools, learning to hunt and gather in increasingly complex ways, and enduring the environmental swings of Ice Age cycles. But by about 100,000 years ago, we start to see hints of movement beyond the continent. Fossils from the Levant, in what is now Israel and Lebanon, show that modern humans were pushing into the margins of Eurasia. Some of these early foray may not have lasted, with populations retreating back into Africa as climates changed, but the impulse was there. The decisive expansion came later, around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago, when genetic data suggest a major dispersal of humans out of Africa. This movement was not a single heroic march, but likely waves of small groups following coastlines, rivers, and grasslands, moving slowly but persistently. Archaeology shows their presence in Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. By 50,000 years ago, they were in Australia, which could only have been reached by sea, even in an Ice Age world with lower sea levels. This alone is a staggering thought. Long before ships, long before written records, small groups of humans had learned how to build watercraft sufficient to cross tens of kilometers of open water. It was not an accident. It was knowledge passed down and refined. These dispersals were not just about geography. They reshaped the human family tree. As modern humans spread into Eurasia, they encountered other hominins, Neanderthals in Europe and parts of Western Asia, Denisovans further east, and perhaps other archaic populations not yet fully known. The evidence now shows that these encounters were not simple replacements. They involved interbreeding. All non-African people alive today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, and some populations in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan ancestry. This blending reminds us that our story is not one of pure lines, but of tangled roots. By 45,000 years ago, modern humans were firmly established across Europe. Sites in places like Romania and Italy preserve the remains of early Europeans who were already crafting ornaments, symbolic art, and specialized hunting tools. In Siberia, humans had moved into cold environments, following herds of mammoth and reindeer. In East Asia, they adapted to river valleys and forests, with archaeological finds in China pointing to a diversity of stone tool traditions. By 40,000 years ago, the human footprint was global in scope. Our species had spread across 3 continents and had already demonstrated a capacity to live in extremes, from tropical rainforests to subarctic plains. Australia deserves special mention. The colonization of Sahul, the ancient landmass that included Australia and New Guinea, marks one of the boldest steps of early humans. To reach it, people had to cross a series of water gaps in what is now Indonesia. The voyage was not a matter of drifting. It required planning, coordination, and an understanding of tides and currents. Once there, humans adapted to a continent filled with marsupials, giant birds, and ecosystems utterly unlike those of Africa or Eurasia. Archaeological sites like Lake in southeastern Australia preserve evidence of human occupation at least 40,000 years ago, with burials and artifacts that testify to symbolic behavior. The point of all this is that by the time humans ever considered reaching the Americas, they were already a species that had proven its ability to conquer distance, to adapt, and to survive in new worlds. They had walked into Europe, sailed into Oceania, and endured the harsh winters of Siberia. They were not wanderers without purpose. They were explorers in the deepest sense, responding to climate shifts, following herds, seeking new resources, and sometimes simply moving because that is what our kind has always done. We sometimes think of migration as a unique event, but the truth is that migration is the defining characteristic of our species. Humans have always been on the move. Archaeologists talk about out of Africa as though it were one event, but in truth it happened again and again. Some early expansions may have failed, leaving no descendants. Others succeeded, planting roots that remain in the genomes of people alive today. The story of leaving Africa is not a straight line, but a series of waves, each shaped by environment, chance, and human resilience. This long prelude also puts into perspective the idea of the Americas as the last great frontier. When we think of people crossing into the New World, It is easy to imagine it as a singular, extraordinary feat. And it was extraordinary. But it was not unprecedented. By the time humans reached the far edges of Asia, they had already accomplished feats that proved such a crossing was possible. They had faced ice, deserts, mountains, and oceans. They had outlived and outcompeted other hominins. They had filled the ecological niches of 3 continents. The Americas was simply the final space left unpopuled. And yet, what makes this moment so haunting is that the evidence is patchy, and our understanding is incomplete. We know people left Africa. We know they spread far and wide. But the precise routes, the exact timing, the identities of the groups are still debated. Did they hug coastlines, fishing and foraging as they went? Did they move inland along rivers and grasslands? Were there multiple pulses of expansion, some of which left no trace? These are questions that scientists wrestle with, and honest answers admit uncertainty. We can say what seems likely, but we cannot claim absolute certainty. When we look at the big picture, the Americas stand out as the last blank on the map. By 40,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia. By 30,000 years ago, they had spread deep into Siberia. Everywhere else had been touched. The Americas remained isolated, a vast ecological continent filled with creatures that had never seen humans. The stage was set, the actors were ready, but the crossing had not yet occurred. So the haunting question is this: if our species had already proven its ability to adapt, to travel, and to thrive in every other corner of the globe, why did it take so long to reach the Americas? Was it geography with ice and oceans forming barriers? Was it chance with no groups happening to make the journey until later? Or were there earlier crossings now lost to time, migrations that failed or left no genetic legacy? The story of walking out of Africa again and again reminds us that our past is not a simple triumphal march. It is a record of persistence, failure, resilience, and mystery. And when we finally turn to the Americas, we carry with us that broader story of a species that has always been in motion, always searching for what lies beyond the horizon. To ease our way into this part of the story, it helps to imagine the world map not as a fixed picture, but as a shifting set of thresholds. Every boundary that humans faced was at first a barrier. The Sahara Desert, the Himalayan mountains, the rivers of Southeast Asia. Each one seemed impossible until in time it was crossed. The slow outward spread of our species is less about bold leaps and more about a pattern. Small groups following the resources in front of them, gradually extending the edge of what they knew. This is how Africa became Eurasia, how Eurasia became Oceania, and eventually how one distant day, Siberia would become the gateway to a whole new hemisphere. This wider journey also reminds us that humans were not unique in moving outward. Animals were spreading too, shifting their ranges in response to climate, tracking vegetation and prey. The difference was that humans carried something extra: culture. Knowledge was passed down, tools refined, languages adapted to new environments. Culture acted like a second inheritance, allowing each generation to begin not from zero, but from the accumulated experience of those before. When people reached new landscapes, they did not just survive by instinct. They survived by memory, by tradition, and by experimenting with what worked. That more than muscle or speed was the secret to why our ancestors could spread so widely. By the time small groups stood on the frozen margins of northern Asia, looking eastward toward what they could not yet know was another continent. They were already the inheritors of this long chain of dispersals. The Americas were not an isolated miracle. They were the final act in a play that had been rehearsed across deserts, forests, and oceans for tens of thousands of years. Who were the ancient North Siberians, and how did they survive at the top of the world? This question leads us into one of the most remarkable and least expected discoveries in recent archaeology. A reminder that our species has always been able to push into environments that seem at first glance impossible for survival. For a long time, scientists assumed that humans only reached the high Arctic much later in prehistory, long after the last glacial maximum. It was thought that the cold, the long winters without sunlight, and the scarcity of resources would have formed a natural barrier. Yet evidence along the Jana River in Siberia tells a very different story. Here, more than 30,000 years ago, people were already living above the Arctic Circle, adapting to the harshness of that world and leaving behind traces of a life that was both practical and surprisingly rich. The Jana rhinoceros horn site, named for the remains of woolly rhinoceros found there, sits on the banks of the Ana River in northeastern Siberia. When it was first excavated, archaeologists were astonished at what they found. Not only were there animal bones and stone tools, but also ornaments, ivory carvings, and evidence of structured activity that showed this was no fleeting campsite. This was a place where people lived, hunted, and imagined. 2 human teeth were eventually recovered belonging to young individuals. From these, scientists were able to extract genetic material that revealed the existence of a population now called the ancient North Siberians. They had branched off from East Asians tens of thousands of years earlier, forming a distinct lineage that would later mix with others to form the ancestors of Native Americans. To survive in that environment required more than simply toughness. It required ingenuity. The Ana River region would have been brutally cold, with temperatures dropping far below freezing for much of the year. The winters would have brought long stretches of darkness, and yet people stayed. They hunted mammoth, rhinoceros, horse, reindeer, and bison, animals that themselves were adapted to the Ice Age steppe. They likely used the hides and furs of these creatures for clothing and their bones and ivory for tools. Archaeologists have found needles with drilled eyes from this period, suggesting that tailored clothing was already being made. Without such clothing, survival in these conditions would have been impossible. What is striking about Jana is not just the fact of human presence, but its scale. The site shows signs of repeated occupation, of a community that may have numbered in the hundreds. This was not a solitary group eking out a living. It was a viable society, one that had found ways to endure and even to thrive in a place once thought uninhabitable. The presence of ornaments and personal items suggests that they were not living lives of constant desperation. They had the time and the will to create, to decorate, to mark meaning onto their world. This reminds us that human adaptation is not only biological, but cultural. People can find warmth in ritual and resilience in shared stories as much as in the hides of the animals they hunt. Genetic analysis of the Yanoth has opened a window into deep population history. It shows that the ancient North Siberians were a separate branch distinct from both Europeans and East Asians, yet connected to them through earlier ancestry. This matters because it shows that humans had spread into the far north earlier and more extensively than previously assumed. The Arctic was not a barrier, but a home, and that home became a crossroads. Over the next several millennia, groups like the ancient North Siberians would encounter and mix with other populations, creating the genetic foundation for later peoples of the Americas. Without their presence, the migration story of the New World would look very different. We should pause here to recognize how much this discovery changes our mental map of prehistory. To think of humans at 30,000 years ago already carving ivory and leaving ornaments in a place where the sun vanishes for months is to confront the resilience of our species. We often underestimate the capabilities of early humans, imagining them as marginal, desperate, barely surviving. The Yarn site challenges that image. It shows planning, adaptation, and symbolic life at what was then the edge of the known world. The environment itself, often called the Mammoth Steppe, was a unique ecosystem stretching across much of northern Eurasia. It was not the barren wasteland we might imagine, but a cold grassland rich in large herbivores. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros were part of this ecosystem, as were steppe bison and reindeer. Humans were part of this system too, hunting, scavenging, and shaping the landscape through fire and movement. The ability to exploit this ecosystem may have given them the skills needed to eventually move further east into lands that led closer and closer to the Americas, yet much remains unknown. We have only a few sites like Jana. How widespread were these ancient North Siberians? How many other camps and settlements now lie buried under permafrost or lost to erosion? What languages did they speak? What myths did they tell? How did they organize their societies? The archaeological record cannot answer these questions fully. All we have are fragments, a carved piece of ivory, a needle, a tooth. From these, we try to imagine entire lives. The haunting question, then, is whether these people ever looked eastward and wondered what lay beyond. At that time, the world was colder, seas were lower, and lands that now drowned by the Arctic Ocean may have been dry and habitable. Did groups of ancient North Siberians venture into those lands long before the more widely known migrations? Were there attempts that failed? Communities that lived for a time and then vanished without leaving descendants? It is possible. Archaeology often gives us the story of those who succeeded, but behind it, there may be countless forgotten journeys. The Anna River site reminds us that by 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, humans were already testing the limits of where they could live. They had conquered deserts, mountains, and forests, and now they had conquered the high Arctic. The final frontier of the Americas still awaited them, but the skills, the endurance, and the imagination needed to cross it were already in place. The ancient North Siberians in their cold camps along the Yana were part of that preparation. They may not have known it, but they were setting the stage for one of the greatest human journeys of all. And so the question lingers, how many other forgotten peoples lived and died at the edges of the map? Their stories reduced to a few bones and tools, their names lost forever, but their presence essential in shaping the migrations that followed. Before we turn fully toward the people of the Anna River, it is worth pausing to consider how extraordinary it is that anyone reached such latitudes at all. Human beings are at their biological core tropical creatures. Our physiology evolved in warm environments, and compared to other animals of the north, we lack fur, we lack layers of fat, we lack claws or natural insulation. What carried us into colder regions was not our bodies, but our ability to reshape the world around us. Fire provided warmth and light. Clothing provided shelter from wind, and social cooperation allowed groups to share food and knowledge. Every move further north was a gamble, but one backed by these cultural tools. As humans pressed into Eurasia, the steppe became both a highway and a proving ground. Vast herds of grazing animals could be followed for hundreds of kilometers, offering meat, hides, and bone. The open landscapes allowed visibility, but they also demanded mobility and planning. To thrive here, groups had to know the movements of animals, anticipate seasonal changes, and prepare stores for the leanest months. It was this constant practice of adaptation that eventually brought them into the realm of permanent snow and permafrost. The archaeological record shows that these expansions were not random wanderings. Campsites appear near rivers, on ridges, in places where resources were most concentrated. Tools were shaped with care, reflecting knowledge passed down and refined. By the time humans reached northeastern Siberia, they had been honing these strategies for tens of thousands of years. The surprise is not that they reached the Arctic, but that we once doubted it. And so, when evidence from Jana appeared, showing a population well established above the Arctic Circle 30,000 years ago, it was less a revelation than a reminder of what humans had already proven capable of. These people were not anomalies. They were the inheritors of a long trajectory of persistence. Their lives may have been hard, but they were not impossible. The skills and the mindset that carried them north would one day help carry others further still toward a continent waiting silently beyond the ice. What happens when two long-separated populations meet again during the harshest ice age? The answer lies not in monuments or stone tools, but in the invisible threads of DNA preserved in the bones of long-dead children and the genomes of people living today. Around 25,000 years ago, in the depths of the last glacial maximum, two human lineages, one that had branched off into the far north of Siberia and another that had lingered further south in East Asia, came together once more. Their meeting produced a new population, one that carried a mixture of both ancestries and would over time become the foundation for all later peoples of the Americas. This event is often described in shorthand as the genetic collision, but in truth it was a quiet and human moment, a merging of families and communities who may never have imagined the legacy they were creating. Geneticists can trace this meeting because the DNA of modern Native Americans carries signatures of both these ancestral groups. The ancient North Siberians, who had endured life above the Arctic Circle for millennia, contributed one part of the heritage. The East Asians, who had remained closer to temperate regions, contributed another. Alone, neither of these lineages matches the genetic profile of later indigenous peoples. Together, they do. The mixture seems to have taken place at or just before the peak of the last ice age, When glaciers expanded, climates dried, and survival became ever more precarious. It was a time of bottlenecks, when human population shrank to small sizes, and isolation became the norm. Yet in some corner of northeastern Asia, people met, exchanged partners, and woo their bloodlines together. What makes this especially fascinating is that the evidence comes not just from living populations, but from ancient remains. At the site of Malta near Lake Bal, a burial of a young boy who lived 24,000 years ago has been studied in detail. His genome shows a mixture of affinities. On one side, links to populations of Western Eurasia. On the other, genetic elements that later appear in Native Americans. He was not an ancestor in the direct sense of a family tree, but his DNA provides a glimpse of the kinds of people present in Siberia at the time, blending ancestries and passing them forward. When scientists compare his genome to others, they see echoes of this mixture repeated, a pattern of fusion that would echo across continents. The context for this meeting is important. The last glacial maximum was not a single uniform freeze, but a series of climatic shifts that reshaped habitats. Vast ice sheets locked up water, lowering sea levels and exposing new lands while simultaneously cutting off routes across northern continents. In Eurasia, deserts expanded, forests shrank, and grasslands turned brittle. Populations were pushed into refugia, places where conditions remained survivable. In East Asia, river valleys may have provided such havens. In the north, steppe environments still supported mammoth, bison, and reindeer. Somewhere at the margins, groups from these regions encountered one another. We cannot know exactly what those encounters looked like. Perhaps it was the gradual intermarriage of neighboring bands, exchanging daughters and sons, as humans often did to form alliances. Perhaps it was the absorption of a smaller group into a larger one after a period of hardship. The genetic data cannot tell us the stories of individuals, but it can show us the outcome. A blended population that carried new genetic signatures. Over the following millennia, these people would remain isolated in the vast Northeast, cut off from further contact with their Asian relatives, developing a distinct genetic identity. This period of isolation is what scientists call the Beringian standstill. The standstill is not a metaphor, but a measurable reality. Genetic studies suggest that after this fusion event, the ancestors of Native Americans were cut off from the rest of Asia for thousands of years. Their DNA began to drift, accumulating changes unique to them. The population,